Welcome back to another episode of Impossible Equals Impossible, a live show that was created to inspire others to focus on their potential instead of accepting their reality. And it has been a couple months since I've done one of these. A lot of travel, a lot of tech issues and craziness going on with LinkedIn, but I'm super excited to be back. We have another epic conversation with an absolute legend today, and I'm really excited for this conversation because it's going to be I may be a little biased, but I think that this conversation's going to be golden. And my guest for today is Joe Jacobi, who's a dear friend and mentor. And so many times I always talk about this. It's so important for me to talk about who people are instead of their accomplishments, right? Because so many times when you come on these shows, people are like, oh, this person's a best-selling author, this or that. But I want to tell you, Joe's one of the most accomplished people that I've met. He's achieved the very peak of his discipline over his career. And probably one of my favorite things about him is that he's probably the most humble person that I've ever met. And I'm super excited to hop into this conversation to get to kind of know a little bit more about him, how he's gotten to where he is. And yeah, just really excited to share him with my network today. So, my guest today is Joe Jacobi. Joe and his partner Scott are the only American Olympic gold medalists in the Whitewater Canoe Slalom event. Joe is a high performance coach, transition specialist, and author who collaborates with high performance leaders to unlock purpose, achieve peak performance, and create lasting impact. Joe currently lives in the Spanish state of Catalunya, which is actually his backyard, is where he won his Olympic gold medal. It was the probably one of the most fascinating conversations that I've gotten to have. And after 40 plus years in the water, through his book, Slalom and River Classes, about how to confront obstacles, advance amid uncertainty, and bring focus to what matters most, and his essay compilation, Thinking in Waves, Joe shares his experiences to help people navigate the waters of their life. And with no further ado, I bring to you my good friend, Joe Jacobi.
Awesome.
Joe, thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor to have you here. And so many times, right? Like you're at that point where you've achieved so many things. And I think what happens a lot, especially in this social media age, is people kind of look at you and think like, oh, this is kind of how everything started, right? Like they see kind of the end product and they think, oh, it was always that way. Tell us a little bit about, Joe Jacobi, like how things started. You're living in Spain now. Like, how did you go
Yeah.
from what was it really that kind of took you to that place? And on your journey to being an Olympic gold medalist, was this something that you always kind of saw yourself doing, or like, how did it all happen?
Listen, as you can tell, I've transitioned my backdrop just for a moment to my balcony, where you can see behind me is the 1992 Olympic whitewater canoeing course. And Paul, I got to tell you, I wasn't going to do this, but when I heard that beautiful pronunciation of Catalunya, I love it. You did it just right. I wanted to bring people out here and just show you what the springtime is like. And by the way, you can see the kids paddling on the water here. Here in La Seu d'Urgell, the town where I live, it's a town of 12,000 people, about 2.5 hours north of Barcelona. Almost every kid in our canoe club, and I've got some stories about where you're from, canoeing stories about where you're from, Paul, during this hour today. But almost every child walks to this course. Like we have over 100 kids in our club, and every kid walks no more than 15 or 20 minutes to get to this Olympic whitewater venue. So it's like right in the middle of town. And I just wanted to show you where we are today, because you just had that beautiful pronunciation of Catalunya. So yeah, I mean, a big part of this background and even the journey to what I just showed you, I know that in the United States, not a lot of people would consider growing up in the Washington, D.C. area as like an advantage for anything, especially today. But believe it or not, I know it's crazy to think for the sport of whitewater canoeing, it was an incredible place to grow up because the Potomac River that flows through the middle of the city has world-class whitewater river rapids. And when I was young, growing up, learning to paddle in the late 1970s and then kind of getting into competition in the early 1980s, whitewater canoeing was actually not on the Olympic program, but the World Championships was like the biggest deal in our sport. Like being world champion, not Olympic champion, like that was the goal. And all the athletes in my training group that were quite a bit older than me, I started to go join our training group when I was 13 years old. And I was almost 10 years younger than most of those athletes. They were all world champions, world medalists, the legendary coach of the sport. And the reason the Washington, D.C. area was so popular was that, you know, you couldn't make a living doing canoeing. Like you did it because you loved the sport, but because you were in a city, you had access to decent jobs and university and good education. So most of the places in the US that have really great whitewater are in mountainous, more rural areas where you don't have as many, especially at that time, opportunities to find good jobs or find good education. So I was very lucky in that respect. And then second part of your question, Paul, is that our world-class training group had a philosophy about training that if you want to be good on the river where the big competition is going to be, you don't get good by staying at home and training. You get good by going to the river where that big event is going to be, and you get to know that river because every river is different. No two rivers are the same. The gradient, the rocks, the amount of flow, it's always changing. So you got to really figure out the nuances of the river, which leads me to how I got to where I am today. My canoe partner and I spent more than 100 days living in this town in the year before the 1992 Olympics. And the focus was the river, that channel I just showed you outside my window. But also in the course of living here, what really happened was that we really aligned and integrated with the culture here, the people, the spirit of the Catalan people. And that was the big impact moment. And I think that connects to why I'm living here today. I lived in the United States for most of those years in between 1992 and today, but I did make a quality of life move to here in 2017. I haven't been to the US in more than 5 years, but I guess we can announce that's going to change in the fall when I come back to the US for the first time for the Outlier Retreat. Thank you, Scott McGregor, for making that happen. And yeah, so that's how I ended up where I am today.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because you talked about two things that really kind of resonated with me. And I think the first part is you were really kind of the outlier in your space, right? Like you talked about how you were training with like world champions and people who were like at the top of their game. And you found a way to like rise to the occasion, right? And it was so fascinating for me. I remember this when you and I were having this conversation because that was like the biggest thing that I had to kind of overcome was the whole age thing, right? When you're like the youngest one in the group, when you're around people who are like so much more accomplished. And it's fascinating to see how I think a lot of people don't realize how work ethic I always like to say that volume makes time irrelevant. Like you do something enough, you can make up like decades of time. You know, if you're just consistent and you practice your discipline. And the other thing that you talked about, which really resonated, is I think international travel for me has been probably the greatest teacher. There's so many things living in the US that I think people take for granted, right? That you really don't kind of understand until you go to like some of these other countries and you see like, oh wow, it's just different. But then the thing that really blew me away is how there's like a massive attitude shift when you travel out of the US. It's like people are so much more um, grateful, and it's just so many unique experiences, like things that we don't have in the US. So I love that.
Lindsay, our mutual awesome friend, the
Our
outstanding
amazing friend.
Lindsay Ruiz wrote, that she liked that comment about figuring out the nuances of the river. And I think embedded in that comment is that then the river really becomes something a little bit more than just the river. It becomes the culture and the people. And the way that plays out is that, I had this epiphany in 1991, my first time in Laseo. In fact, it was the first night I arrived here in Laseo. So in the Olympic world, about 1 year before the Olympics, they typically do a test event. And the test event allows the athletes to kind of try the Olympic whitewater channel for the first time. But it's also for the event organizers too, to kind of run an event, see what it's like to manage spectators, make sure that the scoreboard works and the timing and the volunteers. Everyone needs to get comfortable with the venue. But so that test event in 1991, a year before the 92 Olympics, we arrived here. And Paul, I was just tired. I was run down. I was like this American living out of a duffel bag. It had been 5-6 weeks. And I'm looking at my European competitors, that can sort of go home for a couple of days in between the World Cup races. They get they sleep in their own bed, a home cooked meal by mom. They can do their laundry. We can't do that. We can't just jet back to the US for 2 or 3 days and then come back. And so I had this epiphany. I was young, I was 21, and I just remember sitting in our hotel here in Laseo thinking, a year from now at the Olympic Games, I don't want to feel like an American visitor at the Olympic Games. Like, I want to feel like I belong in Laseo d'Urgell. And what I understood about that moment, what I understood about those words was that meant kind of letting go of some of my beliefs about what it means to be American and appreciate the culture where I am and the spirit of the people where I am. And it was amazing. So many relationships went from being very transactional to just very human and transformational. Whether you go into a restaurant, and back then we used to go into banks and exchange travelers checks, or going to the supermarket. And, we really started to build relationships with people. And over those 100 days, I remember so well leaving the Olympic Village here in Laseo on the day of the Olympic race and feeling that sense of connection and feeling that sense of belonging here. And I think that if I were to transfer that to business or performance in other areas, I think a lot of us know what it feels like to perform well in our home environment, where we're comfortable. But if you're a kind of person that needs to go out on the road and do, for example, motivational speeches or a business presentation, a sales launch, you need to figure out how to sort of unpack your bags, so to speak, when you get there and feel more of yourself, your authentic self when you go into those situations. And you can't do that without practicing that. You got to figure out a way to practice that. And so our sport was so heavily anchored in Europe, and I just kind of figured out just a way that worked well for me. And I've just been practicing that way of living, and it's my everyday now. I have to speak a different language to make an appointment for a haircut, to see the dentist, to go to the supermarket. It's nothing is done for me in my native language.
Yeah, powerful. Lindsay, so great to see you, my friend. And I was just thinking about that too, when we were having this conversation, in many ways, a river is really the perfect metaphor for life, because you really kind of never really know where it's going to go, right? Sometimes there's twists and turns and just a whole bunch of things that are so unpredictable. Joe, I'm curious, like you talked about really immersing yourself in the culture and the environment. Do you believe that that was the reason why you were able to win the gold medal? Was that you knew, not only did you have like obviously the skill and the discipline, and it was probably like a lot of um mental memory at that point because you've been practicing so much. But
Right.
do you believe that that was the difference that kind of gave you a bit of an edge, was that you knew the area probably better than a lot of the other people who were there?
I the way I would answer that question, it's really hard to know. It's a great question, by the way. I don't think I've ever been asked the question that way. What I think, but I do think about the topic of my connection to the people. I think it's really important for people to think about, to anticipate what's going to help them feel their authentic selves on the performance day, on game day, and or in this situation where there's going to be like more tension and more pressure and also more opportunity as well. So I think in that vein, I don't know that it was the difference, but I do believe that it just helped me to be more relaxed, to enjoy what was happening around me, and to be present to what was happening around me in that moment. It was a really different time. By the way, I still think back, like I can't believe what I did not know about my local culture after having spent 100 days here, compared to having now lived here for more than 6.5 years. Like I know much, much more now. And I appreciate those things maybe differently than I did then. And then also, I would say that a couple of other things that sort of played into the performance on the race day. So we had those things that about headspace, making a really good plan. My canoe partner and I we were so deliberate in like mapping out the day and really rehearsing the race day. Well, like we can't control what will happen in the race, but our belief was that we can control everything that happens and how we respond to it from the moment we wake up on race day until we cross the start line and we start paddling, not the finish line, but the start line. So we rehearsed that a lot and thought about that and talked about that a lot for many weeks and months and even up to a year before the Olympics. We didn't know all the details, like what time the race would start and what the course would be. But as we got more information, it's sort of like having an old style camera where you have to do all the focus of the lens yourself. And the picture at first is really blurry. And then you're just making slowly, as you get more information, you're bringing the picture more and more into focus. So we did that and rehearsed that really well. And then the last thing that happened on the water that I think is just so interesting about our story is that, and I write about this in my book, Slalom, we certainly were not the biggest, the fastest, or the strongest doubles canoe in the field. What we did well on the day of the Olympic Games is that we corrected mistakes better than the rest of the field, and we were a little bit better at anticipating the mistakes a little bit before they happened than the rest of the field. Now, normally you talk about course correction and fixing mistakes, and you could convince most people like, oh yeah, if I do that a little bit better, I could see how my performance would improve. But when you tell people like that's fundamentally how you won the Olympic Games, that really stops people in their tracks and say, whoa, like I never would have believed that in a million years. But yeah, like that is true. And I'm always a big believer. I think all of us know the things that we want to do to be successful, but there's like a second system at hand. I always call it system A and system B. And system A is doing the things that you know are right and the things that you want to do. And system B is getting rid of the junk, the crap, the resistance, the obstacles that are getting in the way of you doing system A. And I think that by and large, we don't give enough attention to system B. And that for sure, we would not be Olympic champions without that really big focus on system B.
Yeah, so powerful, and it's like I'm a big believer of that too. Like when I go to visit with my mentor, and like I go to retreats and stuff, people will look at me and they're like, "Why aren't you asking any questions?" And I remember one of the first retreats I went to, I was like, "Well, the reason why I don't ask questions is I feel like we know the things that we have to do, right? Where the disconnect kind of comes is the execution, right? And it's like I remember when I was training with my mentor, she said something. She's like, most of like over 90% of the questions that people are asking is kind of just like a check. Like they have an idea, but they want to check with somebody who is either more experienced or they feel is at like a higher level to like validate themselves. And I think what you spoke to that really spoke to me is that so many times in life, like people are always looking to other people, right, instead of just checking with themselves. Like you and your partner knew that, hey, we really need to like anticipate things, right? Because the thing that's so interesting about fundamentals is like everybody thinks that it's easy and that it's like the basic stuff, but it's like that's how everything starts. And if you look at a lot of things that fall apart, it's because they never mastered the basics. So I love everything that you shared there. I i remember a few years ago I was watching a, I don't know if it was a documentary, if it was like something on YouTube, but it was about Michael Phelps because everybody just looked at him, 19 gold medals, like the most like decorated Olympian in his like in the, because I think there's somebody in the Paralympics who won more, but like in just the regular Olympics, he's like the most decorated Olympian. And I remember him talking about how what everybody thought was like the highest point of his life was actually like a really dark and low time for him because they didn't really understand kind of what it took to get to that level. I'm curious for you, like after you won your Olympic gold medal, did you kind of go through a period of, I don't know if identity crisis would be the correct term, but like did you kind of wonder for a while, like, darn, like what's next for me? Like I achieved the pinnacle thing in this sport, and I mean you were only in your 20s. Like
Yeah.
did you have a challenge with that?
So one story I have written about, but it's not in the book, but is one of my favorite stories. So I have this Olympic hero. He's an American rower named Brad Lewis. So Brad won a gold medal in the 1984 Olympic Games in the doubles sculls with Paul Enquist. And Brad was like this rebel from Southern California that just broke the mold of like the New England Ivy League stereotypical rower. And Paul Inquist, by the way, I mean, he was like the son of a fisherman from Seattle, like up in the northwestern US. They were both really different, but Brad was a lot more extroverted. But anyway, so at the 84 Olympics in LA, these guys win gold medal. And Brad wrote a book. It's pretty hard to find, but it's an amazing Olympic story. It's called The Assault on Lake Casitas. And before the year before the 92 Olympics, our canoeing coach used to read passages out of Brad's book to us to sort of motivate us before workouts. So I felt like Brad was almost like a training partner in our event. So I know it sounds like I'm not answering your question, but really I am. This is a great story. So after the Olympics here in '92, we were still in Barcelona. We spent about 5 days down in Barcelona watching events before we came back to the United States. And I was on a subway train one night in Barcelona, and this tall redheaded guy, started talking to me, and he's telling me like he lives in Newport Beach, California, and all the flatwater kayakers that he knows. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And anyway, I said, this is my stop. Like, my name's Joe Jacobi. And he says, nice to meet you. I'm Brad Lewis. And Paul, like, I've got like tears. Like, I just start crying. I got tears coming out. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you're not going to believe this. You're just one of my heroes. Like, you were on this. I know you don't know it, but you were on the journey with us. Can you come out of the train and just sit and chat for a while? And he agreed. So we get off the train and we're just sitting there on the platform. It's just quiet. Trains are passing. And I'm just have this moment, Paul, to ask Brad all these questions. And Brad asked me what you said. He's like, do you think you're going to do this again? And remember, the next Olympics in 96 were in the United States. Like, it was hard for an Olympic gold medalist to just give that up and walk away. But Brad said, you should think hard about this. It's very unlikely that it'll get better than this. And, and it's hard to figure this out. And, Brad didn't say specifically, don't do it, but he put up a lot of caution about continuing. And he shared with me his challenges in continuing. And I did choose to continue, and I did have challenges in continuing. Like, it's okay that I never won another gold medal, but even immediately after winning the Olympics, I loved the speaking engagements that I did. I loved that opportunity to share the story of our sport, about a sport very few people ever get to do or try or see on TV. So that was a very special opportunity. And I knew that I had to figure out ways to relate the sport of canoeing to the people I was speaking to, like in a very memorable way. And I love doing that. But I very quick, by the spring of 1993, so this is like 6 months later, I knew that I wasn't doing the work of a lot of the younger athletes that were motivated and really starting to train again. And I felt bad. I felt guilty. I felt slow on the water. And I just didn't I felt myself falling back, and I didn't know what to do. And the turnaround there was, I talked to one of the national team coaches, a new coach the United States had hired. And I told him, I said, I just feel like I'm missing out and I'm falling behind, but I really don't want to stop what I'm doing either. And he said, listen, he goes, I wouldn't stop what you're doing either, the speaking. But he said, all you need is just to figure out a plan that works for you and get comfortable with that. It doesn't have to be enough or not enough. It just has to be a plan that works for you. And it was so good. He found this very simplistic way of taking more or less the same training plan that the others were doing, but modifying it, the percentages of the kind of workouts to match my time to train. That was his first question to me. He's like, don't worry that you can't train 7 days a week. How many days a week do you think you can train? That was his question for me. I'm like, 4. I can do 4 days. Great. So he just modified the percentages of low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity race training. And he just applied that to a 4-day training plan, 4-day-a-week training plan. And that was it. It just kind of got me back in the game and sort of got me started. But, those were just some of those ups and downs that you encounter, but it wasn't on the level of Phelps. Should say, at the end of the day, whitewater canoeing is a super fun sport. You're paddling on whitewater river rapids. And when you learn to do it as a kid, if you keep in just not great shape, just okay shape, it's a sport you can do for life. And I'm still doing it. You see these paddles behind me. The tall ones are what Maria and I use to paddle in the sea, and these shorter ones, those are the canoe paddles that Maria and I paddle on the river with. And so Maria and I paddle the same kind of racing canoe that my doubles canoe partner and I raced in the 92 Olympics. And so we're still active in the sport. We do it today. And it's that was 32 years ago that we won the Olympics. And it's I've never enjoyed it more.
Yeah, powerful. I love that story, Joe, because it reminds me of so when I created this show, one of my mentors was the dream guest, and I ended up checking that off my list in 9 months. And I remember having her on. We were talking on the pre-show or whatever, and she's like, well, she's like, you did it. She's like, now you have to get a new goal. And I was like, sometimes and it goes back to this idea, right, of, impossible equals impossible. Like, that was your idol. Like, you wouldn't have ever dreamed of having ran into him at like on a bus, right? Like, just having a conversation. It's so powerful. What I find is so interesting, and I was actually thinking about this because it's been fascinating to see the world kind of evolve to the point where, like how you said, right, when you first started this whole like whitewater canoeing thing, it wasn't like lucrative. Like, you couldn't really make a ton of money, yet you were able to kind of sustain it. And I feel like what you were able to do is probably one of the biggest things that kind of helped to, put the sport really on the map, in the sense, you're always speaking about it. You did incredible like work being a part of like NBC and the Olympics and all these type of things. Looking at kind of where you started versus where you are now, what like three things would you share with somebody? Because I'm sure like you look back at your life and you're like, man, like I didn't ever think that I was here. Or maybe you did. Like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know for me, I constantly reflect and I'm like, darn, like I didn't ever see myself kind of getting to this point. What would you share with somebody that could maybe help them go from like impossible to impossible?
Okay, that last framing helps a lot, a lot, a lot, from impossible to possible. So the first place I would start, it's so easy. I'm just coming up with more mentors that have given me great messages. So um, I'm a big fan of Jim Lair, who is a sports psychologist who wrote the book, The Power of Full Engagement. Jim and his co-founder at the High Performance Institute, Jack Roppel, an exercise physiologist, they were working with the best tennis players in the world in the 1980s and 90s. And then they co-founded this High Performance Institute to sort of transfer the lessons they were learning from high performance sport to business and, organizations. That was a big deal in the 1980s and 1990s. It was very new and cutting edge, very ahead of their time. And then when it was time for them to write books, instead of writing a book together, they each wrote their own book about more or less this similar topic. And Jim's book went a little bit bigger, but Jack's book, The Corporate Athlete, is so good also. Anyway, powerful engagement. The basic thesis is, and this is point number one, that we don't fail to do the things we want to do for lack of time. We fail to do it for lack of energy. So point number one is that manage your energy over time. It's that you can block off the time on your calendar. I'm sure you'll find a way to get it, but if you don't have the capacity to move on it, you're not going to do it. Whereas if you have the energy, even if you don't have the time, you tend to find the time. But, one thing, since we did mention Michael Phelps, I believe that Michael Phelps' greatness wasn't because he was faster swimmer than everyone else. I think it was that he actually recovered from high intensity work more quickly and more effectively than everyone else. And that is energy management to a T, not time management. It's energy management. So I think that, this idea of energy over time would be the first thing of moving from impossible to possible. Second thing I would say is, I'm just sort of thinking of some of my favorites here. We just, at Elevating Leadership Institute, we just did a book club conversation last week about David Epstein's book, Range, where the subtitles is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And the subtitle's a little bit deceiving because it's not saying that specialization is bad. It's really saying that specializing too soon or specializing without awareness, that gets hard. And so I think there's a little bit of a up and down game that we're playing between being a generalist and being a specialist, so that even if you want to specialize in something, I think playing a generalist game and in areas of health and wellness and being well-rounded and giving yourself sort of some space to, really to grow and learn along the way. Or like said another way, if I'm thinking about impossible to possible, rather than make an elaborate plan and get going and run a ton of experiments along the way. Like that's the way of a generalist. So like I would say that would be the second thing, is this idea of just get going and really experiment along the way. And then the third thing is I read a book last year, and I only just heard the writer on Ryan Holiday's podcast recently. I can't think of his name, but the book is called Die with Zero. Die with Zero. It's a book about money management, but of course, it's a lot deeper than money management. And, there's a lot of case about, living life now. I am all about delayed gratification. I get what that means. I do know what that means. But I also think that gets over-indexed in a lot of ways, and we undervalue the opportunities of really living a fully engaged life in the present moment. So it's not waiting until later to travel, but it is figuring out what you want out of travel and what kind of travel works for you today, and believing that doing a little bit of that will lead to more travel, and it's like in that same way, what Die with Zero kind of taught me was that, it does come back. It does put some context around not just the energy we have, but around limited time. And that this idea of really having anything in the bank, or as one of my favorite writers and poets wrote about, John O'Donoghue, from Ireland, who passed away in I think it was 2007. He talked about his experience of being with people at the end of life, and that he experienced all these end of life moments, Paul. And he talked about how there's usually this time between the time you let go and the time you pass. It's not long. It's just a little bit of time, but for a lot of people who get to live to the end, there's just a little bit of time between the time they let go and the time that they actually pass. And he said what he noticed about that moment is that there's a realization about that. Did you squeeze all the juice out of the orange? That's exactly how he said it. Did you leave juice in the orange, or did you really squeeze it all out and really enjoy the juice of the fruits? And so that reminds me of the kind of the Die with Zero piece, and being present and engaging with the resources that you have now to sort of move the needle on these big, hard, challenging projects. Like even like a lot of people imagine moving to another country and learning to speak another language as like an impossible project. And it just starts with the smallest, silliest little step forward that gets repeated constantly and daily. So those are my long-winded answer to the three things about impossible to possible.
No, like I love everything that you shared, Joe, and it's been so fun for me because it's like in our other interactions, like you're the one that's usually like quiet, and now like I get to hear you speak and just learn so much from you. And I always learn from you, like even just based off of a lot of like nonverbal things, like how present like you are in conversations, but also just like how you acknowledge and elevate people. Like I've learned so much from you in that perspective. And I think one of the biggest things that you really talked about in that specialization and generalization conversation is really about like framework, right? Because I remember when I first came on LinkedIn and people are like, you have to niche down, like you have to do this and this. We obviously had Michael Easter, and he talked about this idea of a lot of times like things are 99% right but 100% wrong. Like the concept is right, but the way that people are explaining it or like why they think that it works is kind of like wrong. And
Yes.
I think that's what I really learned when it came down to being able to like niche down was the way that it was explained was it was kind of like a restrictive thing. Like, oh, you only work with people in this. But what I've kind of come to realize is that it's really about like a target, because I've always had experience, like because I there was a point in my finance career where you could have put like anybody in front of me, and I would have had experience, like I would have known what to do. So for me, I never felt like I had to niche down because my experience was just so vast and so broad. But what I've come to find is that a lot of times the reason why people don't attract anything is because they don't know kind of like what they're targeting. And recently that was like a huge shift for me, and I'm starting to see it where it's like it almost kind of creates curiosity in a way, because you'll meet people who maybe don't align in that like area that you're specializing. Like for example, like if I'm saying like I'm working with people who are 50 plus, but somebody comes up to me who's like 30 or 40, and they're like, you know I need help with all the things that you're doing, and I align with the values. What I didn't understand was it's not saying that you can't work with them. It almost in a way kind of brings more attention to you than just going general, because people are wondering like, hey, well, I'm 30, like why can I work with you, or things like that. So I love everything that you said there. And then the third piece about being present, one of the biggest things that I've done this year for me is like removing expectations, right? I think so many times we go into conversations, whether it's like business or personal, like trying to sell, or like, oh, we're trying to like always get something from people. And I've found so much more like freedom in just like being present with people, like just listening to conversations, not always trying to respond and like kind of get them to think for themselves. So I love everything that you said there for sure. And then the last piece that I wanted to kind of touch up on, you talked about how there's really kind of this like harmony, right, between living in the present but also kind of planning for the future.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think I probably learned this being born and raised in Hawaii, because anytime that I would travel, I was so far away from that place. I mean, the closest continental state in the continental US is California, and it's like a 5 hour flight. So it's like anytime that I went somewhere, I knew that there was probably a high possibility that that would probably be my only shot. And there were so many times where it's like you question, do I buy this? Do I go to this thing? And I was just like, that's my only shot. So I think that was a really powerful experience for me, because it taught me to really value experience and making memories instead of like materialistic things. So I love everything that you said for sure.
Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm glad you brought the Hawaii part up, and that I would reference something about canoeing as well. In 1989, I had a hernia operation. I was on the national team. We had a really good year, and I scheduled this hernia operation at this hospital in Indianapolis that was a sponsor of USA Canoe Kayak. And so I knew there was a recovery period. So I used the fall of 1989. I did a public relations internship for the national governing body for USA Canoe Kayak, and I did the hernia operation there. Well, there was a flatwater sprint canoe racing athletes there, and we had two athletes from Hawaii, Hunter and Wyatt. And we've had athletes from Hawaii, in the program before. It makes sense. Like, I mean, Americans don't. Americans would have a hard time really understanding a Hawaiian's relationship to the water. It is like nothing that exists anywhere else in the United States. It's just inside of them in a different way. I know there are other places where people sail and they boat and they fish and it's inside of them. I'm just saying that the water is inside of Hawaiians in a very different way. And so when they're present in the canoeing community, you feel that as well. And it was really cool because Wyatt ended up qualifying for the 92 Olympics in flatwater. Even though I'm a whitewater person, it was amazing reconnecting with him at the opening ceremonies in Barcelona. And yeah, and Hawaii is still a really important part of the U.S. canoe kayak program. But one of the things that I would tell you, Paul, that's so interesting is that in the sport of canoeing, kids tend to over specialize really, really early in one discipline of canoeing. And pretty much the antithesis, the opposite of that, is canoeing in Hawaii. You know, these guys are on paddle boards, they're in kayaks, they're on surf skis, they're on surfboards. If it's on outrigger boats, like if it's on water and there's a paddle, like they do it, and they do it from young age. There is no better example of like a generalist approach to canoeing. And, you know, in some ways, like it could be that maybe Hawaii has missed out on some opportunities to win medals at high level races, but they've brought something else to the sport that the sport could not get any other way if Hawaiians didn't bring their unique relationship to the water to that event, whether they win medal or not. And I think you start to see what people bring to a competition that transcends winning a medal at that event. And that's what my time paddling with Hawaiians have always taught me, is that, and it's such a beautiful approach to the water. And I think it's really hard for all of us that were raised in the continental US to really appreciate that about Hawaiians' relationship with water.
Yeah, powerful. It's funny that you talk about water, because every time that like I travel somewhere, I always laugh because I've really only, I'd say, lived two places like long term, Florida and Hawaii, and both are pretty much, you know, there's a ton of water. And I always feel like that was kind of a huge common thing for me, is that I was always around the water. And hearing like your metaphors and how like you kind of relate the water in many ways to, like, you know, our river journey of life, it kind of makes sense to me how and why that is. I'm curious for you, Joe. You, one of the things that we talked about in the bio, right, you wrote a book, Slalom, the 6 river classes, about how to confront obstacles, advance uncertainty, and bring focus to what matters most. I'm curious for you, kind of two-part question. What was your purpose and kind of what made you write the book? And then what was maybe something that you kind of wish that you knew that you would share with like authors who are kind of either writing their first book or they want to write one?
So a great question. On the first part of the question was that I kind of had long said that the river has been my best life coach, bar none. I've never had a better life coach than the river. And that means that, you know, I figured out how to have an interactive and especially like a listening kind of relationship to the water from a very young age. Like you learn how the river is speaking to you, everything from how it passes over rocks, around rocks, waves, hydraulics, you know, gradient, canyon walls, waves. You run the gamut. Strategically, tactically, with a team, or like in a raft, or with another person, or in your own boat. There's like all these things that the river is teaching you, but you know, you have to understand some fundamental things. So the book it's not my story. In fact, if you read the book, what you'll really feel is that I and like to an extent my canoe partner Scott, we're just kind of like guides in the book that is helping you see your life as a kind of a navigation of a river. And when you understand some of the principles of doing that, and that you're not reading the river incorrectly. So like a great example of that, Paul, would be like a lot of people who are under incredible stress, you know, they feel like their life feels like being in a raft with no paddles, skimming right towards killer death fang 50-foot waterfall. You know, they feel like that. They feel like they're about to go over the waterfall and die. And really, because they haven't really been, open to the different possibilities of how rivers work and how rivers flow, what really might be happening is that the river isn't like technically hard or difficult. It's just going around a bend, and you cannot see around the bend of a river, but there's a bunch of strategies for navigating water going around a bend. Most importantly, you pay a lot of attention to the water you're on right now and navigate that well. That will be the best recipe for navigating what's coming next, is doing better with what you have right now. But I think being able to figure out, kind of map your life and your situations, that I don't want to say it's impossible that you might not be heading towards a big waterfall, but 99.9% of the people are not headed towards the big, death waterfall. And so when you figure out whether you're going around a bend or whether you have your river is coming to a split and you have to choose left or right, or maybe you have two channels of a river and they're coming together, which creates a lot of change and a lot of disruption in the current as two river currents become one. This happens when you collaborate with someone, or someone's company gets bought and merges. There's an acquisition and merges into another culture. That's an example of two river currents coming together as one. The book is about learning how to read the river currents of your life so that you can make better choices and better understandings about what's going to put you in the best position to do that. And, and to also appreciate that in life, there is a bigger force of energy than your own muscle, than what you can generate. There is a bigger universal force of energy out there. And it's not that it's always going to be working for you, but if you're ignoring it, you are missing one of the greatest forces, most beautiful forces of life that, I believe it's like, at least in part, what we were created to experience was to experience that. But if you're just looking upon yourself to navigate the river, it's not that you can't, but you're just missing something that's so beautiful and something that you were really designed to see. And it's just a matter of if you're going to awaken and open your eyes to see it.
Yeah, that was powerful. I think there's been so many, I think, mic drop moments for me, but I think what you just said was probably one of the most, you can always tell the difference, right, between somebody who's good at something and somebody who is great at the top of their game. And I feel like when the way that you just talked about the river being the greatest teacher that you've ever had was probably one of the biggest takeaways I think that I'll have from this conversation, because the question that I love, it's my favorite question. I love asking everybody who comes on this show is who's been the most impactful person that, you've either met or you've, interacted with in life, and what was the most valuable lesson that they taught you? And I think what I really learned, I think that allowed me to expand my perspective, is sometimes the answer to that question isn't always necessarily people, right? Like you said, it's the river, or growing up in Hawaii. For me, I've learned so much. I look at the mountains as kind of a metaphor for life, because when I look at goals, and this was really more when I became an entrepreneur, I would think about how when you just start, you have this goal and you're darn, that's so far out, you can't see it. Oh, this is impossible. And then I used to get that same feeling when I was either driving by, or sometimes I'd be walking and you can see the mountain peaks. And I would think to myself, darn, getting up there, that's such a reach. But the thing that I learned for me when we're talking about performance and peaks and all these things is that there's a reason why when people summit, they stand on top of the mountain, because mountains have peaks. But as people, I really don't believe that, we have a peak. Like you said, if you're always expanding your capacity, if you're learning something new every day, if you're trying to just constantly push what you can handle, you'll become kind of a limitless person. And I love everything that you shared. Joe, I'm really curious, because The way that you so eloquently spoke about the purpose of your book, the biggest focus for me this year, my word theme and area of focus has been intuition. And I feel like one of the common things from pretty much anybody who's done anything massive or achieved like a great level of success is when 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 they're asked the question like what is the most like valuable thing that you possess that kind of got you, their intuition is usually always that thing. I'm curious for you, like how has the river or the water, how has that allowed you to not only build your intuition, but like for somebody like me, right, who's still kind of like practicing it, learning to kind of listen and trust yourself, what would you kind of share from your journey, both for you, but other like clients and stuff that you've helped that can really help people advance?
So, one of this tag, my tagline on LinkedIn is the unlock your power, purpose, and potential to navigate challenging midlife transitions with meaning and adventure. And yeah, the reason I added the last part, the with meaning and adventure, meaning speaks to purpose, but the adventure speaks to this relationship with nature. And I hope maybe one of the things that comes through is that, and I think our relationship with nature, it evolves. Like I can tell you, once upon a time, I thought nature was kind of there to serve me. Like I could lead this busy life and then, oh, I could go out in nature and disconnect and it will help me do that. And there's no doubt it does that. Like you can be a busy person and you can go out into nature and figure out what it's all about. But I think if you open yourself to nature in a different way, there's an opportunity to build, like as I was talking about with the river, but anywhere in nature, to have more of a two-way relationship with nature where, you're there to serve it as much as it's there to serve you. And that was a big change for me in what you're talking about. I felt like that helped me to be a lot more intuitive and to, and by the way, you don't have to run hard whitewater river rapids or, like I did a really difficult trail running race here in Laseo this past weekend, but you don't have to do those things to have those kind of moments. Like you can sit on a park bench and be looking at a leaf on the ground or be looking at the insects or the birds or the wildlife that's around you. And you can learn to listen and have a relationship with nature, just like you would have a relationship with a friend. And so to that end is that I think that's one of the things that's coming up to me in the conversation, Paul, is like how to help more people uh, be open and aware to that. And I am all for wherever our life and technology is going and the developments of AI. And I'm only just speaking for someone that is 54 years old, and I hope I'm around for a long time. And I keep healthy, and I'll do my best to do that. Should I do that? Should I be around to even see what happens in the next 30, 40, maybe 50 years? Who knows? Uh, I always believe that nature is going to have an increasingly more important and increasingly bigger role to play in the human relationship and the human connection. Because I think the more that technology does and the relationship with it grows, it's going to take us in one direction that just has to be counterbalanced by something else. And I don't I think authentically human way of that happening is going to be nature.
Yeah, powerful. It's so interesting that you talk about like nature and that, because I definitely, nature for me has been like a really powerful tool to practice like self-awareness. I remember, was it last year? Yeah, last year, oh actually like almost a year ago to the day, I did the 12-hour walk. And
Oh
it
yeah.
it was so interesting because it's like when you really like detach and disconnect from all the technology and you can actually like hear your own voice. I think sometimes like there's so much noise and distractions that becomes a challenge. But I think the biggest thing that I learned is that so many times like we kind of like see things like, you know, we know that they're there, but you don't actually like see it. And that was the thing for me that really changed things. I was like, oh wow, like I didn't notice that this was there. And you know, this was an area that I had lived in for over a year, right?
Yeah.
Like it was so interesting to see kind of how that aspect really played into things. And obviously like Joe, like you're so much more than just a kayaker, right? You've run marathons, like you've done so many things. Like you're a true athlete. And where I want to go next is I don't I'll just be transparent with people. I don't read a lot of newsletters or like articles and stuff, but one of my favorites has been Thinking in Waves. And I feel like one of the reasons why it's been one of my favorites is you do a lot of reflection in there, which is something that I kind of do every day. You kind of touched upon the purpose and kind of why you wrote your book, right? Slalom Six Rivers. What was really the purpose behind Thinking in Waves, and what has kind of been like a massive takeaway that you've learned personally from doing it and going on that journey?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but one thing I have figured out. So I've been publishing Thinking in Waves now for 4 months, and for those that don't know, this is a weekly essay that I write that transfers my experiences and lessons surfing offshore ocean waves in a surf ski kayak to an innovative model for more clear thinking, making better choices and more values and increased values alignment. And the difference between what I'm doing in the sea and what I did on the river with the book, Paul, was that I'm not going to be Olympic or world champion in surf ski. I'm getting better at it. I'm learning it, you know, in that spirit of being a generalist. Like I'm getting moving, and then I'm running experiments along the way. And what I'm doing is I'm sharing these experiences on the wave and these modeling what's happening on the waves to meet people in real life. But I'm not doing it as an expert or declaring myself as like an expert in waves. Like we're learning together. And the response has been amazing. It's been really good for me. It's a really fun way for me to process what I'm doing and honor the coaches that I'm working with in this sport. So I've been kind of making a point to also say, like, I just had this kind of life in canoeing that I never paid for coaching. You know, I got good at a young age and had the National Federation paid for coaching. And then it came along with being successful in the sport until now I pay for coaching in surf ski. And two things, you know, so number one, I'm paying for coaching for the first time in my life. And number two, these are the best coaches I've ever worked with in my life. I can't believe it. And so by sharing what I'm learning from them about surfing waves and transferring it to how it meets people today, you know, I just published today this an essay about Esquena Box, which is this big outdoor sports festival we have here in Laseo. And it was this past weekend, and I did the mountain trail race. And this race can be really brutal at times. In fact, when I explained it to my brother, who is like one of the most enduring athletes I know, he's like in his early 60s, and he's been running marathons and half marathons for more than 40 years. And that was his word. He's like, brutal. And yet it wasn't brutal for me this year. It was a good run. But the reason I say this is that I brought that back to the surfing and waves, what I call the wave surfing progression. And step one is what we call basic speed. Before you ever go out and surf waves, before you catch the first wave, you have to know what your like all day, everyday pace of life is. And this is just a basic concept. And it's not hard to improve basic speed. Like, it's why I wrote today's post. It's like, it's a two-step process. One is get myself outside the door to the outdoors every day. And step two is move my feet. That's it. It's nothing more complicated than that. And I've been doing that every day. And I mentioned in there, I've been doing that every day for more than 5 years without a single piece of technology on my runs. No watch, no phone, no heart rate monitor, no data, no tracking, nothing. That's just crappy weight I don't want to carry with me. And so, yeah, you talk about thinking in waves. Like, I'm not expert on it, but I found a really good way of helping to meet people where they are. And when I see people use the metaphor of surfing a wave in the wrong way, or if you and I looked around a bunch of LinkedIn accounts, I could go, that person's surfing a wave, that person's surfing a wave, that person's surfing a wave. Problem is, they're going in the wrong direction. They just don't know it yet, but it's really fun to be on the wave. And when they realize that wave comes to an end and they're further away from the goal where they wanted to be, only because they didn't look at step 3 of the wave surfing progression, which is direction. It's like, if you don't choose a direction, you're going to find yourself, yeehaw, surfing a wave, but in a direction that's taking you further away from where you want to go. I just think it's a really interesting metaphor to bring more context and clarity to, so that people can use it to their advantage better. Mm-hmm. That's what Thinking in Waves is doing. It's been a phenomenal experience. I love doing it, but the response to it has been amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're winding down, Joe. I just have 2 more quick points that I want to make. Yeah. So before I save my last selfish personal question, tell us about what's next for you, right? We kind of hinted in the beginning that you're going to be coming to the US for the first time in almost 7 years. And talk to us a little bit about, Elevating Leadership Institute and a lot of things that you're doing there.
So, 2 things. We have the Outlier Project Retreat in Rhode Island. And I've never met Scott McGregor before. We've been friends for a long time, long before Outlier Project was formed. So it's going to be amazing to be with him. But the thing about the Outlier Project Retreat, the speakers don't just come in and out on an afternoon and give their speech. Everyone is there together for 4 days. And so it's about building relationships, having those one-to-one conversations. So I'm a bit overwhelmed about just coming to the US in general, but not overwhelmed at all. I think I can already feel a space of love, around Outlier Project Retreat. And I couldn't be more excited about that, that event coming up in the fall. And then secondly, Elevating Leadership Institute, which I'm doing with Bahar and Montes and Inga. This is a growth hub that we've created for leaders who want to elevate, impact, and influence. And what's interesting, being that most of us have high performance athletic background, Olympic background. Bahar was world-class bodybuilder, international stage bodybuilder. Our focus there is that it's not like there's a lack of knowledge, but there's a lack of attention to how to practice and setting the training conditions for skill development. And we think we've created a really good way to go about that at Elevating in our programs, and a way to bring the community together. But the good news about Elevating is that beyond our our paid programs, we have amazing community in the group already that is a free community. We have book club, and the first lecture of every one of our paid programs is always free. We're going to be doing 4 of these programs in 2024. The first one starts next week, which is breaking free of the bottleneck, unlocking your competitive edge. And so, that we'll do that free event on our platform next week. And so, a lot of good things going on. So this has been great. And you got one more question for me, which I'm excited to dig into.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about earlier, right? Like the thing that made you stand out of I've met so many legends over the past 2 years. You, I mean, I'm sure it's like there, but I feel like out of all the people that I've met, I feel like your ego is practically like non-existent. Like I remember our first interaction. I didn't even know that you were an Olympic gold medalist until like people had to tell me, and I was like, oh wow, right? Like I want to know from you, especially because I'm only in my 20s. Like I feel like this would be such a really powerful skill to learn. How have you learned to kind of like manage your ego? And it's like, what were maybe like one or two things that maybe it could be experiences or stories, but like what would you share with somebody about learning like how to check your ego? And yeah.
It by really literally we could do a round two on this one question, which I think we should. But here's how I'll start that. It hasn't always been that way. We talked about my Olympic experience here in Laseo. We went to the Olympic Park on August 2nd, 1992 to do the best we can. We left the park that day as Olympic champions. That's not what we prepared to do. We prepared to do the very best we could. Having said that, Paul, I feel like at 22 years old, I probably started to think about, and it sort of feels like someone puts a crown on your head and a cape around your shoulders and you weren't expecting it. And now you got to like, you're figuring out like, what do I do with this? And you really start to think about like, okay, like, what does this mean? Like, what do I have to be right about? What do I have to stand for? What does this mean for relationships? And like, actually, the ego really does start to stand up. And honestly, Paul, it did for almost 30 years more after that. And what happened was, is I was kind of right around 50 years old, was that, I think living here gave me the opportunity to kind of revisit some of those choices that I made back in 1992 and leaned into without really ever checking on them. And then literally like my ego was just kind of waving the white flag here to myself and saying, Joe, we're tired. We got to shut this down. This is insane. And the thing is that we have an inner self, we have an inner voice. And the problem is, I think, or for me, is that what I see is that for so many, the inner voice, it atrophies. It doesn't get used. People don't see it. They don't feel it. And then the ego gets tired and you haven't used it enough. And so I am working on a piece of writing right now that I hope to share later this year called the Midlife Peak Performance Manifesto. And in there's a principle that I call the 200% principle. Like I know mathematically this doesn't make sense, but finding balance between our external voice and our internal voice, it would be easy to say 50-50. But like, what does that mean? Like, it's hard. How do I know what's 50? And so I'm like, oh, what would be what I really understood is what does 100% external mean and 100% internal mean? And if I add those two together and try to get those as close to 200%, that made a lot more sense to me. And what happened is I had to kind of really, I often find at this stage of my life is I have to bring up my external voice. My internal voice is pretty fired up. Like I've taught it how to work again and flex it. And in the process is like, it's a recalibration, but 200% was a lot easier to understand than 100%. Like two sets of 100, like monitoring myself on any given day without judgment. How am I doing on my external on a scale of 1 to 100? How am I doing on my internal scale of 1 to 100? Add those two together. I can see that. That makes a lot more sense to me than, well, what's 50-50? I don't really, that's too complicated. It was too complicated. So that was the idea of the 200% performance principle.
Oh my goodness, Joe, like what a way to end this. I feel like you're right. Like we definitely, I don't know whether we do another like one of these or like we do a LinkedIn audio event or something, but it's like what a way to end it. It's almost kind of like on a cliffhanger where people have to like come back to see how it finishes. Man, Joe, this has been like an incredible conversation. I've learned so much. I can't wait to like go rewatch this so I can like actually take notes, because it's so hard to like do both. I'm just like keeping track in my head of all these like takeaways and gems that you've dropped. But I can't wait until I can go back, really understand kind of everything that was said and take notes and figure out like what is it that I'm going to implement. So I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been such a fun conversation. And yeah, before we go, I'm going to hand it back to you. Any final things that you want to share or plug?
Well, this is it, Paul. We just get better by having these conversations and talking things out. I'm really grateful. I see Steve Thomas showed up, which was awesome. Lindsay was here, just two of my favorite people. And yeah, thank you so much. Let's just keep the conversation going. And speaking of conversations, I'm going to jump here, and I hope others will join me as Inga and Bahar get ready to have a conversation on LinkedIn Live starting at the top of the hour about career development. And Paul, we're so grateful that you're a part of our elevating community as well. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to chat more, Joe, and hopefully everything works out, and we'll see each other later this year.
All right. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you, Joe. Have a good day.
All right. You too.